with that, let's get into our ID masterclass today. So let me just call up some slides to share with you here. Joe, I know you're driving. I'll just read them out as we go along. So
Thank you.
So I've just, in terms of what we'll get through today, there's a few different points. The first thing I thought we should do is just a check in on our peak performance indicator with everyone to see, you know, how we're all traveling. Maybe people got some things going on they want to lean on the group for or share with the group, particularly even if it's positive news. If there's any particular discussion points or issues that people would like to raise and get the benefit from the class on, let's table those. Then we'll talk about the topic of diversity and inclusion and dig into that more deeply from an ID perspective. And then I'll finish off by reminding you of what's coming up, because in case anyone has to leave early, there's a 3-week break now between this class and the next webinar. You know, every 6 months, we've sort of got to do a catch up to get back into our monthly sequence. And so this is one of those weeks. So it's a 3-week break from now until the next Living in Stride webinar. And then we've got the ID Masterclass on the 27th, 28th. So the 27th is US, 28th is Australia. Same with July 13 and 14. All right, so with that, let's just do a quick check-in with each other. And in the chat, you might just want to put down what your score is. I think here everyone is familiar with the model of the peak performance indicator. So on that scale of 0 to 10, or whatever adjective you would like to use to describe where you're at, why don't you just put down in the chat, I've got to find where it is, chat, what your score would be today.
I can't type, so I'm going to tell you I'm a 10 today.
You're a 10, Joe?
I am. I'm a 10.
Good on you. Got a few 10s today, I see. Judy's a 10, Susie's a 10, you're a 10, got some 9s. This is consistently the highest scoring team or group of people that I encounter, that's for sure. They're very high scores, guys. Excellent. What it means to me, and I'd love commentary from any of you that want to share. I mean, what it means, first of all, is from a leadership position, you're casting a good shadow, you're vibrating good energy out to other people and therefore being a positive influence, but not by anything you're doing or saying, just by how you're showing up and who you are being. That's a great place to come from. So in terms of the vision that we all have of not only, you know, having everyone in the world know and use their ID, but being mini worlds, you know, of being an example of what that looks like to other people. So they want what you're having. That's a great place to come from. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share, maybe around how they got there or what's going on for them that they wanted to particularly share with the group? No pressure, just in case anyone wants to share.
I have a little snippet.
Okay.
You know, it's been a very, very positive move for me. All the decisions that I made since about the 1st of February have been extremely good for me.
Good.
And now I'm in this community of about 100 people over the age of 62. And they've all been welcoming and kind and helpful and all that kind of thing. Until one day I was on the elevator and this woman got on and I said to her, I don't think I've met you yet. She said, I'm Irene. And I said, I'm Judy. I'm moving into 707. And she said, well, how do you like it here? I said, I just love it here. And she said, well, give it some time. And I said, I don't subscribe to that theory. I love it here, period. And I got off the elevator.
Sounds like a good elevator to get off.
And ever since, I've seen her probably a half a dozen times since then, and she's a totally different person.
That's great. There you go. You've already made a difference. Good on you, Judy. Ellen, I'm curious about your score, 9.5. What's that 0.5 blocker?
So I think I went and played tennis with that lady that was in the elevator with you. There's a woman named Sally, who of course none of you will know, and she's about 112 years old, and she's on my tennis league. And I didn't know this, but nobody wants to play with her. And but she brings good snacks, so I was like, I'll be her partner. And every time we missed a point, she goes, "You need to do this. You need to do that." This was at 9 o'clock this morning. You need to stand over there. I need you to do this. I just looked at her and I was like, and the other team was embarrassed. The team we were playing against was like, wow. And mind you, this is a B league, right? With no endorsements. Nike's not calling, none of that. And so she goes, so I just looked at her and I said, these women are 20 and 30 years younger than we are. And so I need you to stop giving me direction. We just need to have fun. And she goes, well, you said you were a newer player, which she interpreted as something else, right? I got flushed with shame during the thing, and all I want to do is get out of there. And then when I got back, I was like, what do I need? You know, like, what do I need? Like, who do I need to surround myself with? Who do I need to talk to? Do I need to eat? What do I need to ask for? And I never would have done that before ID so quickly. I would have gone down, I would have stayed on the elevator and gone down further on the elevator. And it just didn't, I just didn't have the intuitive action to do that. So
right.
That's why I'm a 9.5, 12 hours later or 8 hours later.
You'll probably be a 10 by the time we finish this call, which will be great.
Always, always.
Earn that. You know, the thing is with ID, there are still people that think, well, you can't be that score all the time, or I've got that score because I'm in a good place and things are going well, right? The real magic is when you've actually got challenges happening around you, but because of, to your point, Ellen, because you now understand yourself and you understand the strategies you need to get back in stride, you can actually navigate that really well. There's a number of leaders, if I called them right now out of the blue, I know that no matter what challenge they've got on, they'll tell me a score of 8, 9, or 10 because they really are committed to living in that space, you know. And of course, they can have occasional moments where they might be pulled a bit further down, but by and large, they're riding that elevator on the top floors, you know, and a good place to be. All right.
I just want to add one more thing too. The other side of the doing something positive to take care of myself coin is that I was tempted to write a text to the coordinator and say, this was the worst tennis experience I've ever had. I'm never going to play with her again, all that. And I just didn't do that. I wrote it and then I erased it and then I wrote it and erased it. And I got to tell you, that's the thing I'm actually most proud of is that I did not follow through on that. And that's a result of taking care of my needs. You know what I mean? And not just reacting out of, and you know, I was hungry and I was tired. It's 95 degrees in Chicago. So, you know, there's the positive side of like, what do I need to do? And then there's the side of what do I not need to do?
Totally.
Thanks.
Great call. I mean, it's really so cool that you're present enough to be aware of what you're vibrating, because that is key. Is so Greg in the chat put down, he's been vibrating gratitude, you know, and I think being very aware of what is that emotion or that mindset that you're vibrating, because that then permeates through everything that you do. So well done. Anyone else? Maybe one more if there's anyone got something before we move on. All right, let's move on then to the topic of the day, which is this topic of diversity and inclusion. So I'm just going to recap where we left off last time. So if just a quick recap, I think most people were on our Living in Stride webinar where we talked about the broader topic of diversity and inclusion and its relevance to ID. So if we just go back, it's an evolving topic that, you know, historically was really a topic that related to minority groups. You know, in the States particularly, it was a lot to do with Black and then Black women. That was when people talked about diversity and inclusion. That's what they were really referring to, but they didn't use those words necessarily. But it did expand further to include things around, you know, other races, religion, multicultural sort of issues, and then eventually even people with disability. And I'll say disability meaning obvious physical disability, you know, because if we, and we're not talking, when I say history, and I was preparing this, I thought we're not actually talking that long ago. We're probably talking no more than 10 years ago. Disability was, the closest we got to the physical sort of side, but now you look at it, including things like mental health and the whole notion of accessibility, which is even included in our technologies today. It's not just that on an elevator you have some, braille for someone to type, or you've got ramps for people to come up into a building in a wheelchair. That was what it was years ago. Now it's much more broad. So you've got a much bigger a much bigger focus on the inclusion piece, which is to cover time zones, for example, when we're all working across the world now with, very varied workplaces. You've got the LGBTQI movement and conversations. I mean, look what happened this week with World Swimming, with FINA and the decision that they made. I mean, it's as recent as a few days ago. You've got the whole concept of bullying in the workplace becoming way more, not just sexual harassment, which was a more obvious physical thing, but the bullying that goes on and the emotional torment that people feel and raise and are getting heard for in the workplace now. Style diversity, mindset diversity. You've got people like Microsoft make it a big part of their culture to have like a growth mindset. I mean, look at the amount of noise and commentary that's been around that space. And of course, in the last sort of 5 years, mental health, and particularly through COVID, the attention that's been given to the more whole person of their personal life as a responsibility for employers. Different companies now having days off. I learned of a company this week that is having a shutdown in July for the Independence Day, long weekend. Is going to be a company-wide shutdown. Normally, I know companies do that at Christmas. Now there's a company doing it in July, and there's probably more than one. Just one that's I know of, and I'm sure we'll see more of it. And then out of our conversation last week, I think it was Grant Eggington made the comment that there's a real binary approach to these things, that the minute we talk about the topic of it, there's like an either or element to it, and that in itself fuels more exclusivity rather than inclusion. So then the question, I think, becomes, where are we going? Where is it, if this is an evolving journey, where is it heading to? And I put this in that I know in the conversations I'm having with companies, I talk about, like at Cisco, the head of HR shifted from being head of HR to the chief people officer, and now is the chief people, policy and purpose officer. And purpose is becoming much more, and the section of the business that owned inclusion and diversity now owns purpose and the inclusive future for all vision of that company. Inclusive future for all is their new vision. So this concept of inclusion of everyone, everywhere, every time, no matter what time zone, no matter what race, no matter what, age, gender, it's equality for all. So what they're striving for, and say they meaning where this movement's going to, if you spend time in this area, is it's about not just what you're doing, but are people feeling desired, safe and valued and respected for their uniqueness because of their uniqueness, not in spite of their uniqueness. That's a big shift. And I think if we're going to be on the front foot, being a beacon of equality and shining people being at their best, this is a mindset that it would be wise for all of us to become more aware of and strive towards. Any questions from what we covered last time? All right. So then we also explored, with examples and stories where people felt judged, contained or diminished because of their uniqueness, and accepted, encouraged and expanded. And so that's where I was just talking with Greg at the start. Greg made the comment that it's 50 years coming up in September since he first came to Australia. And as a loud, extroverted American with a big accent compared to most of the people in Canada and Australia, he had to tone that down, that was, it wasn't okay to just be, open about that. He had to be really conscious about that. And that's a good example of where something as simple as, oh, by the way, if I lose my power here, guys, if I go off, maybe someone can carry it, Greg or Ian. I just lost my lights, and I do have workers here at the moment, and I hope they don't turn my power off. When I take a break here in a sec, I'll go and tell them not to. We talked about how ID helps. You know, it gives you another positive way to see yourself and present your uniqueness. It helps people get each other and bridge that gap that might normally exist that prevents, you know, inclusion and acceptance from happening. And then it just even encourages you to think about diversity in terms of, well, if you're different and other people are different, how do we work that together? And if we're going to do that for mindset diversity, are we also doing that for gender, for geography, for age? You know, are we covering the whole spectrum of diversity? So that was a more overall conversation that we had, sprinkled in a little bit of ID, but knowing that we're going to really dig into that today. So then the question becomes, and I presented some of this last time, are IDs equal for everyone? Like, does everyone cope with diversity equally, or are there some IDs that struggle with diversity more so than others? Are there some that are really tuned into it and it's almost like a natural gift they have to work with diversity? What do you need to feel seen, heard, and understood, and feel safe to speak up and be your truest self, particularly when working with people who are different? What are your biases and blind spots? And how does your ID make a positive contribution to building psychological safety? So I thought what we might do to get into this today is just stop for a couple of minutes and let you reflect. I'm going to leave these questions up, and I want you just to jot down your instinctive reaction. Like, what's your instinctive reaction to the first question? What's your instinctive reaction about your ID working with diversity? Do you think you've got an advantage, or is it a struggle for you? You know, what comes up for you straight away when you look at that third bullet there about what do you need? I don't need a whole, you know, summary of all of your needs, but what are the one or two things that just come up straight away that when you think of your whole ID, and hopefully most of us can get a chance to share responses to these questions. What do you think your biases and blind spots are? And then just by being you, how does your ID and the way you show up make a positive contribution to building psychological safety? I thought this would be really rich for all of us to share on these topics today. So hopefully we can get around most of these, and those who have something that they want to share can do that. So spend a couple of minutes just reflecting on them. I'm going to quickly remind my tradesman not to turn my power off, and I'll be back within a minute. All right, let's get into our conversation today. So who would like to kick something off? Does anyone have anything that they're jumping out of their skin with that they want to share for themselves first? Like, what do you think for yourself when it comes to, are all IDs equal in the space of diversity? Or is your experience of ID that some are going to struggle with it more than others? And don't be afraid to speak up about your experience of even different IDs. Okay, so I'm going to start and just kick this off. I'm going to suggest that at face value, I think there's that it's not equal when it comes to diversity. My experience of ID is that there are some IDs that are more tuned into diversity than others. So I would just describe it this way. The ID that sort of goes up from the left, like from verify and then across and down, that's the ID that struggles more with diversity than the one that goes down to up. So if you're, for example, 7771, so, you know, up on verify, authenticate, complete, down on improvise, like that's the style, versus someone who's 4438, you know, down on the first three and up in the end, that the first is more going to struggle with diversity. They're more in tune with doing it their way. There is a way, there's a right way, there's a sense of judgment about how things get done, versus The second style of ID that's much more open and in fact thrives on having diversity. The ID, like an avoid verifier, naturally reaches out for variety of perspective to collaborate, and then is open to, the variety of responses they might get, as opposed to a verifier, for example, who collaborates in order to find the right answer. And once they have determined an outcome from that collaboration, there is a sense of either or, that there's a right or a more right way than others, a more right time zone than others. There's still some sense of judgment that doesn't foster the equality that you'd want to have for real diversity and inclusion. So, and I know some of you either agree with that or have IDs that could be affected by that. I'd be really interested what your reactions might be.
Yes, Paul.
Well,
I think. Sorry. Yes, Paul. I think. I think me being the up, up, down, down. I quite agree with you. And the thing that really has helped me in terms of a more stable base is ID, and the fact that other really different IDs add a whole new value to my judgmentalism,
Yeah.
Where before I was basically, obviously always right and real. I really gained a lot understanding that there's other ways, there are other people, other views. Some of the views I'll still discount as not my way, but ID enabled me to be more inclusive.
True. That's true. And what's interesting about that, Doug, is it's still, you've got your instinct and you've got your conscious awareness. So the conscious awareness certainly helps, but as you would know, the instincts are still there, aren't they?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can't beat those.
Thank you. Joe, you were going to share something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, probably one of the things that I've always noticed and people have always commented on, I suppose, is that it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's a CEO or a politician or a street sweeper or a whoever. I'd seem to be able to just communicate with that person as if just because they're just people to me. So I think if I think about diversity, yes, I've got some blind spots, and yes, I can be opinionated from time to time and quite often. But at the same time, it's the way that my approach to diversity has come up, and just thinking about the use authenticate as well as the use improvise 2728 I am. So it's actually seemed to be really helpful for me to just be able to talk to anybody and approach them not in the same way, but without highlighting differences or without interacting differently because of their position or because of their race or their ethnicity or whatever the heck it is. So so I guess for me, when you were talking about it, I was thinking it's always amazed me how people look so black and white at that thing, because it's so obvious that it's not black and white when it comes to having different people and interacting differently. So I don't know whether that makes sense, but hopefully it does.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious if there's anyone that's got an ID that, based on what I just shared, would sort of say, well, yeah, I've got an ID that should be more a naturally diverse or inclusive ID, but I don't feel that is me, or vice versa. Someone who's got like the up, 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 down, or the verify through to avoid improvise, and it may have been true, and you've actually found some ways to become much more fluent with diversity and inclusion. Like Doug said, just the awareness of it helped him become more aware and able to cope with those differences.
I find that it helps me not draw so quick on people. Like if I feel disappointed, but there's two parts to this to me. What do I do when I feel excluded? Like, well, how does my ID handle the fact that I feel like I've been pushed out or ignored or dismissed? The other part is, how do I get better at including others when I've dismissed them, right? So this thing that we have about exclusion, it's us doing it. It's not the government doing it. So I find with ID, it helps me find a better way to be useful with the 8 and get over it quickly. Like, what else can I do? What else can I do in this situation? Helps me get over when I'm dismissing others. And the same thing when I feel dismissed is, well, what else can I do in this moment, in this situation, to feel included or to include myself, somehow. And it keeps coming back to, the useful and the flexibility stuff every time,
How does your ID react to feeling excluded, Greg?
Quick draw. Like it's like, it's that's the biggest trigger for me, is to be dismissed, ignored, devalued. Someone calls me to ask for some help on something, I give them an idea and they argue with it, and I go, why did you call me? So that's the first thing out of my mouth sometimes, is go, oh, well, F you then. And so to not do that, it's like I play the Alzheimer's game, or else I just go, okay, what did you mean by that? I have to drill in, so be more useful. My wife says, go to work. When at work, you're very tolerant, you take your time, you really listen. Could you go to work now? Pretend I'm a seminar.
That's good. That's good. All right. Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, Greg, what you just mentioned, it caused me to remember when we listen, when you're listening and you feel triggered because you feel excluded, then there's an opportunity to either listen to respond or listen to understand. And when you have those thoughts, and I've had those thoughts, well, go to hell then. And when I found the way to switch to understanding by asking more questions to gain more perspective, then it's been helpful for me to see that I wasn't being excluded. When I was little, my cousin Roman, he had a nickname for me. The nickname was Studio Stinky Mouse. And I hated that. And I hated him, not really hate, but I didn't like him because he would call me that. And I carried that with me. I was probably 7 or 8 when he started calling me that. I carried that with me until maybe 15 years ago at his funeral. I came in and his children were all there, and I hadn't seen them for quite a long time. And so I went up to one of them and I said, I haven't seen any of you for a long time. And I'm Judy. And he said, oh, you're Studio. And through that conversation, I learned that Roman only chose names like that for people he really loved. So I thought, he was giving me a bad time. And that was my perception, and carried that with me for so many years of my life until I learned that he really loved me. And that's why he gave me that name.
It's interesting, the conversations we have with ourselves, isn't it? Change the conversation, change the way you show up.
Mm-hmm.
All right. What about Leonie? I saw your comment in the chat, and you said you think different IDs approach it differently. I'm curious for you, because you're close to one of the IDs I was referring to that might struggle at times with diversity. How do you go with that? Have you sort of found a way around that? Do you agree with that? Do you find it had a different experience?
Yes, thanks. Look, I agree. I think absolutely that it is harder. There is that instinctive response around judgment, and And yeah, it can be more difficult. And I agree with everyone else in how the awareness has really helped, and the valuing of difference helps. I would love some feedback. I'm interested in what people think from an organisational perspective. So if we're talking individually here, often we're in organisations where there are, D&I programs or people in charge of running programs. And so my comment was, I think, around if you had, an up-down versus a down-up pattern running an ID program, like a D&I program, I think they'd approach that differently because, and I'm not sure about this, but my gut feel is perhaps that, some, avoid verify would be very strong on the collaborative element, and as long as we're all together, it'll all work. And the, collaboration, I'm pretty sure as a verify that, it more might be, well, absolutely, what's the purpose of the program here, and how are we going to get the best result for this program? And so I'm interested in thinking at that broader level of how people, if they're thinking about implementing change, how they come at that from their ID, and where there might be advantages or disadvantages, and how they might need to think about how do they bring the diversity of people in the organisation along with them. So what things might, get the verifiers on board, and what things might get the avoid verifiers on board. So that might be interesting.
Well, we've done a fair bit of work in that sort of space, actually, with cross-functional teams. And I know this is going to be really controversial, but I'll just share it because this is the masterclass. Having worked with a number of cross-functional teams, the teams that are led by avoid verify, like, so the second type of ID, the avoid verify, so, up to the right, they are the more successful, diverse or cross-functional teams compared to those led by the first type of ID. And we've actually done blind studies that have shown that, so if and when you're working with teams that are forming intentionally collaborative cross-functional teams, looking at who leads those teams is really critical to their success. And I've seen, where you get a strong verifier, they'll dominate and drive that media, and it won't have the level of collaboration and diversity, and therefore won't be as successful. It'll actually start to shut down and become back more to a silo, like the natural energy will flow to becoming more of a silo. No different to when you're at university and you're in a group assignment, and whilst there's 6 of you in the assignment, everyone's meant to be contributing, in the end, somebody takes the lead, gets it done, and everyone else gets a mark, on behalf of the group, or as part of the group, but it's really done by one person. That's often the behavior and outcome in a team led by, like the up, down type of ID, but I'm not saying it's just up, down. It could be like a strong verify, avoid, improvise, regardless of the other two. That's the general pattern. So it's really smart to be aware of that, particularly as the world is moving more to collaborative spaces and teams. That's going to be a very contentious point, I think. I've even seen it in working with leaders, people that have an ID, like if I said like Jim's ID, or probably more like Jim on this call, but even someone like Cliff, when they think about having led a functional team versus a cross-functional team, the cross-functional team is wildly more successful than the functional team. And I've said to them, like, you might even not, I'm not saying this about Jim and Cliff per se, but they may not have even been that successful running a functional team where they're going to be more of a manager of that team. But when they're more of a leader of the collaboration, of a cross-functional team, the team just shines. And more the point, they love it. So, it's a really interesting perspective to have for how we coach people, depending on whether they're working or leading a silo type team, a functional team, or a cross-functional team.
Paul, for everyone, a comment. I grew up in a household that was racist and prejudiced, and at 17 I left because I knew there was something wrong Now I'm a down up, but I didn't understand what was wrong until I started to get out to the real world. And what made a big difference is when I met a lady who was up, down, and very open-minded and very non-judgmental and accepting. That's when I started to understand, a better understanding of it. Ironically, though, it was 45 years later, I got to do my ID and then had a better understanding again of what that meant.
Yep. Yep. All right, let's move on and talk about your biases. What did you or sorry, the third bullet point there on the screen, what do you need to feel seen, heard, and understood, and to have that feeling of safety that allows you to shine? What did some of you write down? If it was just a word or a couple of words, couple of phrases, just a snapshot. Be interesting to hear what you put down and maybe where that comes from for you regarding your ID. Who wants to share? No one have anything down? Maybe someone that hasn't shared.
I wrote that I I need to be like recognized for my intelligence as opposed to judged for on, like, you know, female, black, blah, blah, blah. Like that when I ask, you know, 4,000 questions with my Use Verify, as opposed to people making up a story about why I'm asking the questions. It's like, this is similar to what I was exploring last week with, there's an opportunity to use ID to break down those barriers, right? To just say, like, you know, there's diversity of all kinds of ways, not just what somebody looks like. So I need to be not judged by what I look like, but the quality of my questions. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, regardless, if someone was blind and couldn't see you, you know, and they were just reacting to what they could hear and experience, what would they do then and say then?
Yeah, before Skype, right? I used to get this all the time. I didn't know you were black. I used to get this all the time.
Wow.
And so the reactions, you know, and there's probably not a woman on this call that doesn't get this, that you've given an idea or asked a question, and then a man across the boardroom table asks the same question, and then everybody goes to answer it, right? You know, and like, brilliant, Jim. You know, it's like, yeah.
And does that still happen for you? Wow. Wow. Thanks, Ellen. Anyone else? Steve, what are you thinking? You've got an ID like Leonie, that I wonder how you're thinking about diversity and inclusion, and what you need to feel safe to be able to be you.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Good morning, everyone. From which part of the ID triggers off. As you know, I run a cross-functional team, both locally and offshore, and working in a very male chauvinist style of industry, where Ellen was talking about diversity due to race. I work in the banking industry, which is heavily male-driven, and I bumped into our second in charge of the whole business out of Europe, a German guy. Not saying he's German was the reason, but he came across very, very arrogant, and he put a few people offside, and he's very, very racist in his outlook from point of view of, he looks down at you, so don't you know who I am, sort of thing. And that is a sort of diversity and shutting people out, and an elitism type stuff. And I found myself, the third point, or the second one, how to feel seen, heard, and understood. And I had a discussion with him, and I think what Ellen is sharing, that she had a strong self-awareness what was going on, and then that self-awareness going, so okay, well, this has triggered a whole bunch of emotions that are going off for me. yeah, so be it, that's the trigger, but my self-confidence doesn't come from their way of looking at me or how they're dealing with me. So it was, my value comes from, I think what you're saying here, just knowing your ID and living in that confidence. And these are the things I bring to the table. If you don't like it, a little bit what Greg said, well, you can take it or leave it. But this is my value. This is what I bring to the table. If you don't like or whatever, well, that's not necessarily my problem, it's your problem. Yeah, so I suppose the two things is diversity can come from this. This was a white Anglo-Saxon male in a male white Anglo-Saxon setting, but being very, very arrogant and creating diversity because you weren't the same as him, or you didn't know who he was, and the non-elitist type of stuff, which it was really sad to see, actually. But my self-awareness kicked in and said, well, I have a chance to be cheesed off, but that doesn't help me. So came back to my self-confidence and say, well, this is where I'm at. So yeah, take it or leave it. So yeah, I'm not totally clear on all those sort of things, Paul. It's a very interesting discussion because you see diversity coming up. You kicked on one with the sports thing this week. It's just so many variations of it. Sometimes we just don't see it, and then also smacks us in the face.
Yeah. Krista.
One thing that when I was looking at that strikes me is I think I've been really spending a lot of time thinking about it's more my job to make myself comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that as a white woman with privilege, like I need to really be showing up in spaces where if I'm not feeling uncomfortable, I might not be doing the diversity and equity and anti-racism work that I need to be doing. So what do I need to do to create the stage for me to feel uncomfortable? And part of me also really feels like as a use verify, especially as a 70, that I feel like at least in the US, that our culture is really set up and white supremacy culture really values verifiers. And so that's another privilege on top of another privilege that, you know, being logical and how I'm wired to think and communicate very much fits in with what white culture values. And so for me, I feel like I'm really constantly trying to do a better job of checking myself and recognizing that now not only is my privilege come from my gender, my ethnicity, my economic class, but now also I think from my ID. So that's something that I've just been thinking a lot about lately.
Isn't that an irony? You know, that the very ID you have gives you a privilege, and yet it's the same ID that probably creates the problem in the first place. You know what I mean? Like, but there's so many of us, or at least there's an equal number of verify as avoid verify. We know that from our research. But so many of for example, the teaching community and the employer community are so heavily dominated with verifiers led in leadership roles. So it makes you feel like the dominant drive is the verified drive, when in actual fact, by virtue of the fact that there's half the people that aren't, you know, there's a suppression right there.
Well, I think as verifiers too, like we're so worried about getting it right, that it's how do I shift my mind that getting it right is by being willing to hear what I'm getting wrong. That's the right thing to do, is to be able to receive what I'm doing subconsciously or that is wrong. And so I think it's also a matter of really kind of coaching ourselves around that.
I think what you just shared is absolutely brilliant, Krista. The last few minutes have been like an absolute nugget out of this session today so far. I think that perspective is absolutely brilliant and came across way too quick. You know, I think what you just said deserves almost being slowed right down and really thought about every word you just said. I think it was really quite profound. And I, for one, probably want to go back and listen to just those few words again and really dwell on them. You know, I think it's really quite powerful. Something I hadn't thought about before with that drive. What I will say is, if I think about the drives that struggle and don't struggle, I talked before about the whole ID, but I really think it comes a lot to do with the verify drive. You know, I think that the avoid verify has a natural affinity and advantage in the inclusion space and the non-discrimination space and the equality space and the collaboration space. And the drive that struggles with all of that more than any other is the verify drive, because it naturally thinks hierarchically. It's naturally looking for right, which says there's a wrong, you know? So it's got knowledge, so it wants to espouse that and is more into telling rather than listening, and being open-minded to the variety of different ways. So on that verify spectrum, I think that itself has a lot to do with how people excel or otherwise with this whole topic of diversity and inclusion. And interestingly, in so many of the companies that are investing heavily into the D&I space, you look at the population, and to Leonie's point, if we looked at this organizationally, we've got organizations where 75% of the leadership, and I'm talking thousands of people when I say that, 75% of the thousands are verifiers. So it's almost like no matter what they do in that space to be better at D&I, they've got an antibody, that's always working against them in a very strong way, because 75% of the energy is actually driven in the discrimination space, as it were. But I don't think that's the only drive. When I reflect on this, preparing for this class, I think the drives that probably have a natural or a more of an advantage in D&I would be avoid, verify. I think the completer drive, because the completers are all into harmony and inclusion, like everyone fitting together and no one standing out. But then the avoid verifiers love the variety of avoid completers love the variety of differences. So I think there's a more natural, thriving and coping mechanism there. The improvisers, it's fun for them to have all that different variety. That just adds more spice and energy. So I think they thrive on all of that. So I think they're like the four directions: avoid, verify, both directions for complete, and use improvise. I think would be the ones that stand out to me and map to my experience where they feel more comfortable. I think I didn't have any read on the authenticate drive. I can see where authenticators can both be really good with it and not, and the same with avoid. And I can see the avoid improvisers, that safety being a struggle because they're risk averse, but then they don't necessarily say too much about it, so it doesn't stand out as much. But I do think when you break it down per drive, there are various directions that have either a struggle with it or a more natural advantage with this space.
I agree with that, Paul. I as I'm listening first to Krista and now to you, I realize that most of the times I feel most comfortable to be me and bring my best game is with other authenticates, and I feel like I've got to be more on guard and more be careful of what's going on with the verifiers, because mainly for me, it interrupts where I'm trying to get, because they want to come in with a criticism or a thing that I'm not done yet, and they don't get to hear the story. And it seems like more work. And I've often said this to some of the authenticates in my life. I said, it just seems easier. We can get things done. And when they're dismissive, it's never about me, it's the thing. Whereas I feel dismissed personally from a verifier. Like I feel that there's a judgment that comes with that's not present with the other drives. And even with there, like she's a 4 and a verify, but her high 8.2 for complete and improvised. I get frustrated with her just not keeping up with where I think I want to go, but I don't feel judgment. And I think if what you said, Krista, really struck with me strongly, because if we guys could just back off the judgmentalism, we'll hear your criticism, but with this sense of not only are you wrong, but you're wrong for being wrong. It's just like, well, that's when we reach for the guns, And then when I get past that with someone with verify, I find them a partner and a half, because they're giving me the information I'm not getting. They're thinking the questions I'm not thinking. And when they can take the judgment off, I'm so loyal,
Wow, you just said something really significant for me, Greg. Not only are they wrong, but they're wrong for being wrong. And that's so true. I shamefully admit that as an 8 in verify myself, that there is, you don't think that way. You don't think that, but when you unpack what you were thinking, it's the same thing, and it would land even worse, Yeah, that's really powerful.
Can I just say I completely agree with you, Greg, about, you know, you and I, when we met, I mean, we just hit it off immediately, and that was that use authenticate drive. It just meant that we didn't have to try and work out what each other was saying. We just said what needed to be said, and there was no hidden meanings or anything, and that just does make it so much easier. And so that's and thinking about what I need to be me, it is just, I guess it's a certain level of respect and a certain amount of listening, a certain type of listening from other people to just not judge me and allow me to be who I am. But then if they do judge me, then yeah, similar to, I can't remember who said it before, but it's their problem, not my problem. So so it's and it's about leaving it with them and them being responsible for it, without being arrogant about it, but it's about just not taking that on. So, but it certainly is about having that space to be me, and allow other people to be them. That's so important.
Krista, can I come back to a comment that you shared on getting comfortable with being uncomfortable? How can it be for you? Can you see where it cannot be uncomfortable? Where, you know what I mean?
I mean, maybe this is the 70, right? Because I think, especially when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work, like normally the way these conversations will go, I think inside an agency, when you're having these conversations, is people saying, hey, when you do this or say this, or this policy that you've been a part of, here's how it impacts me, right? So typically those conversations are like, oh, as a verifier, I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't do the right thing, or oh my gosh, I didn't know that, or oh my gosh, I'm doing a behavior that is embedded in racism that I didn't realize. And so I think for me, then that's where the self-critique, right, that we're so hard on ourselves, starts to kick in, right? Because, and then especially because I feel like I've caused harm to somebody else. Like I might have had all the positive intent in the world, but my impact landed in a way that I didn't want it to land. But I think for me, what I've really tried to do over time is just frame it for myself differently. It's, you know, it's like that saying about how like racism is, it's like it's raining all the time. And if somebody came to you and you didn't even realize it was raining and said, here's an umbrella, like you wouldn't feel bad that they gave you an umbrella. You'd be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for giving me an umbrella. Like this is so helpful. So I think that's how I've tried to shift my mindset around these conversations and be like, somebody's handing me an umbrella, like, oh great, thank you so much for the umbrella. I'm so curious. I so want to be better. I so want to learn, and trying to ease some of that off. So for me, it's a mental model that I've been working with on myself. But I think at the end of the day, if I feel that I've intentionally or unintentionally caused harm or haven't showed up in a way that people felt was a good ally, then I go to that 5% and I critique myself. And so it's how do I get that piece to stop?
Okay. Well, I mean, it's instinctive, right? So it's always going to be there. And when I think about it, it challenged me to think about, for the 4 different drives, what are the different spectrums? So if for example, we're talking about verified drive, it's like a spectrum of inclusion and collaboration and diversity, then what's the equivalent for the authenticate, complete, and the improvised drives? There is overall equality. So even though there might be advantages for certain IDs, like say avoid verify when it comes to diversity and inclusion, there would be other things where other drives have got their advantages and disadvantages, and it would be fun to sort of unpack what they might be, for example. But I think just the awareness for the verifiers of being aware that, okay, so this is a thing, you know, and just because we're aware doesn't mean it'll go away, because it is wired deeply into us. But by being more cognizant of it, and maybe taking on the concept of mastery, which is the driver for verifiers to sort of overturn and get really good at things, just that confidence, the competence that can come from tackling like that, and then the influence you could have across many other verifiers over time, could be a really wonderful way to address that topic. It is what comes up more and more. I mean, when you think about one of those questions about what are the biases and blind spots, you know, what comes up a lot in the workplace for that drive, the verified drive, is bullying. You know, it's a horrible word. Everyone would hate to think of themselves as a bully. Like some people, I've had some leaders be told, you know, you're intimidating, and they go, oh yeah, that's me. Yeah, I'm intimidating. You know, and it doesn't. They almost want to own it. It sounds like a power thing. And then someone will say you're really arrogant, and they're like, well, you know, that's your thoughts, and it doesn't seem to sting enough for them to want to do anything about it. But then you say to someone, you're a bully, and they're like, whoa, no one wants to be a bully. And that not only is, a bad brand, it's almost like legally, it's now an illegal thing to have, I mean, there are court cases about, and people dismissed for bullying. You got people whose employment contracts will say, rightful or wrongful dismissal, and now bullying would fall in the right space of that's why someone was dismissed. So, bullying is, when we talk about, us at our worst, verifiers, when they're in their bad place, they come across as, and depending on the other drives, but it's exacerbated when they're not open to more diversity, when they're sort of locking on just dominating with their way. That comes across to everyone else, even other verifiers, as bullying. And I've seen it, I've experienced it, and I pretty much see it only with the verified drive. And I will say it's a strong, that I'll cross them down sort of style. And I think it is something, it's not just about being aware of diversity and inclusion. It's also being aware of when you're in your worst place, you're not as in stride as you could be. The way that you can show up in that diversity and collaboration space is in a shape of bullying, which is dangerous and obviously horrible for people around you. By the way, not just in a work context, it particularly can be that way in a personal relationship and in your home environment. And it doesn't mean you've got to be extrovertedly, like overtly bullying. It can be the feeling that someone else has when you're dominating and blocking them being able to be themselves. But that's the experience I have. I was one of bullying. I think it's really valuable to be aware of that. I don't know of any avoid verifier experience where someone's been accused of bullying. And I'm not saying they haven't been, but I've poked around for this for quite a while to understand it myself. And I've never had that feedback about the avoid verify drive. It's almost exclusively in the verify space. I think this spectrum, is, and given how many leaders we work with in the verify space, I think it's a really good thing for us as more, aware ID people to be aware of that.
Paul, I've just got a question around that. So when you talk about the bullying style, what about the person that's being bullied? Have you actually looked at that type of style as well to see if there's a leaning to a type at all?
Even verifiers can feel and be affected and be destroyed by someone else's verifying on top of them. No one is immune to it. It's not like it only affects people, for example, who are avoid verify or some other drive. Now, I will just say I have also seen other people being bullying. Like I've seen completers do that when they've stuck to a plan and they're indignant about that's the plan and the time frame and how we're going to do it. And I've seen authenticators be that way where they're just it's not really bullying, it's not the word. It's probably a similar feeling, but that word is normally assigned to the verify drive. Guys, we're out of time once again for these great discussions. Thank you for being here today. I'll just remind you again that when we come back, that the topic, thanks to Judy Saber. Judy, this was you asking about whether we could have a conversation around partnering up. You didn't say that, sorry, about teaming and what's involved in choosing the right business, marketing. And I put here life partner, not to get into the whole personal conversation, but just when we think of it from an ID point of view and what your ID needs to really shine, what would that bring? Like, is team more relevant to certain IDs than others? Does some even need a team? Do they thrive on a team? Even the concept of family, for some people, is that where they sort of need to have that if they want to have children or they want to have what would be considered normal? But is it easy and a place where they thrive, or are there real challenges for some IDs more than others, like what we were just talking about for diversity and inclusion? I think it'd be a really interesting topic and we'll sort of present it when we come back mid-July, and then we'll unpack that in the depths of ID in our masterclass at the end of the month on July 27, 28. So
Thank you, Paul.
you're very welcome. Thank you for raising it. I think it'd be a fascinating conversation, and the minute I sort of pondered it, there were just a whole number of insights that I know I could share, and I really would love to hear other people's perspectives on this. So guys, have a great rest of day in the next couple of weeks, and we'll see you in 3 weeks' time on July 13 and 14. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.